Imagine standing on the edge of the world, shoulder to shoulder with your closest friend. You are strong. You are confident. The sky is a piercing blue. And then, with a sound like a cracking whip, the entire mountainside gives way. In less than 3 seconds, the world turns to white. And when the dust settles, you are alone. This isn't a movie script. This is the brutal reality of June 12, 1978, on the slopes of the Savage Mountain. We often hear about the triumphs of the summit, or the disasters that claim entire teams. But sometimes, the most heartbreaking stories are about the specific, singular loss of a good man. Today, we are talking about Nick Estcourt, a father, a husband, and perhaps the finest British climber of his generation who disappeared into the ice of K2, leaving a void that has never truly been filled. Welcome back to K2 Stories. If you have been with us before, you know we treat these mountains, and the souls who rest on them with the utmost respect. We are here to preserve their history, not just sensationalize their tragedy. If you value deep dive storytelling that honors the history of alpinism, please take a moment to gently hit that subscribe button and join our community. It helps us keep these memories alive. To understand why the death of Nick Estcourt shook the mountaineering world to its core, we have to understand the era. The late 1970s was the golden age of British climbing. These men, Bonington, Scott Haston, Estcourt, they were like a band of brothers. They had already conquered the southwest face of Everest. They felt invincible, but K2 is not Everest. K2 does not care about your resume. And on that fateful expedition in 1978, aiming for the treacherous West Ridge, the mountain lay in wait, preparing a trap that even the greatest climbers on Earth could not foresee. This is the story of how the perfect team met the perfect storm. To appreciate the magnitude of the loss on that June morning, we have to step back and look at who these men were. If you follow mountaineering history, the names on the 1978 permit read like a Hall of Fame induction list. You had the leader, Chris Bonington, the mastermind of British alpinism. You had Doug Scott, the man who had crawled down the Ogre with 2 broken legs just the year before. You had Peter Boardman and Joe Tasker, the young, brilliant, dynamic duo. And then, you had Nick Estcourt. For those of you listening who remember the late 70s, you know it was a different time. There was no GPS, no satellite phones to call home, and certainly no commercial helicopters on standby to pluck you off a ridge if things went south. When you walked into the Karakoram in 1978, you were walking off the map. You were on your own. And this team, they were the dream team. 3 years prior, in 1975, they had done the impossible. They solved the southwest face of Everest. They were the rock stars of the altitude world. They arrived in Pakistan not with arrogance, but with a quiet, steely confidence. They believed they had the formula to unlock the hardest problems on Earth. Their target was the West Ridge of K2. Now, for the non-climbers among us, let me explain why this matters. The standard route up K2 Abruzzi spurs, already deadlier than Everest. But the West Ridge? It is a monster. It is a long, tortuous knife-edge spine of rock and ice that is battered by the prevailing westerly winds. It requires technical rock climbing skills at altitudes where a human being can barely breathe. To choose this route wasn't just ambitious. It was a statement. They wanted to do it the hard way. But let's talk about Nick Estcourt. In a group of oversized personalities, Nick was the anchor. He was 35 years old, a computer programmer by trade, but on the mountain, he was an absolute machine. He wasn't the loudest guy in the tent, but he was arguably the most reliable. During the 1975 Everest expedition, it was Nick Estcourt who had led the charge through the rock band, the most difficult section of that face. He didn't get to stand on the summit that year. He sacrificed his own shot so that others could go up, but everyone knew that the success of the team rested on Nick's shoulders. Chris Bonington, the expedition leader, considered Nick not just a teammate, but a close confidant and a dear friend. He was the kind of guy you wanted beside you when the storm hit. He was solid. He was a family man, deeply in love with his wife Caroline, and a father to their 3 children. He had everything to live for, which makes what happened next so incredibly difficult to reconcile. The team arrived at base camp in May of 1978. The mood was high. They spent weeks ferrying loads, establishing camps, and acclimatizing. The work was grueling, but to them, it was rhythmic. It was what they were born to do. However, K2 has a temperament unlike any other peak. It is moody, it is spiteful. As May turned to June, the mountain began to show its teeth. The weather was inconsistent. Heavy snowfalls would blanket the ridges, followed by brief windows of sun that weren't quite long enough to settle the snowpack. If you are a skier or a climber, you know the word avalanche usually brings to mind a massive, thundering cloud of white powder. But on the high peaks, the most dangerous avalanches are often the ones you don't hear until it's too late. They are the wind slabs, layers of hard, wind-packed snow, sitting on top of loose, sugary ice. They are like loaded mousetraps, waiting for a trigger. By early June, the team was pushing the route forward. They had established Camp 1 on the saddle of the West Ridge. The views were spectacular, looking out over the vast glaciers of the Karakoram, but underneath their boots, the snow structure was changing. The wind was relentless, piling up fresh drifts on the lee slopes, the exact slopes they had to cross to move supplies between camps. Nick Estcourt, ever the workhorse, was right in the thick of it. He felt strong. In his letters home, he expressed the usual concerns about the weather, but there was no sense of impending doom. Why would there be? He was with the best climbers in the world, on the mountain of his dreams. But K2 is a master of deception. It lures you in with a beautiful morning, blue skies, and firm snow, hiding the instability just inches beneath the surface. As the team prepared for the next phase of the climb, aiming to push towards Camp 2, they were walking into a geological loaded gun. The camaraderie was strong, the tea was hot, and the laughter in the mess tent was loud. They didn't know that the clock was ticking down. They didn't know that the perfect team was about to face a test that skill, strength, and experience could not solve. On the morning of June 12th, the trap was set. June 12, 1978, began as a day of work. In high-altitude mountaineering, there are very few glory days where you stand on a summit with your arms raised. Most days are defined by the grind, the heavy breathing, the taste of cold metallic air, and the endless repetition of putting one foot in front of the other. On this particular morning, the objective was straightforward. The team needed to stock Camp 2. They were moving up the West Ridge, a route that is less of a direct line and more of a complex puzzle of rock bands, snowfields, and Nick Estcourt traverses. Nick Estcourt and Doug Scott were paired up. Now pause for a second and consider that pairing. You have Nick, the steady, analytical, powerhouse of endurance. And you have Doug Scott, the visionary, the man who had survived the impossible on the Ogre just a year prior. Together, they were arguably the strongest rope team on the planet at that moment. They were carrying heavy loads, food, fuel, oxygen bottles, the lifeblood of the expedition. They left Camp 1 and began the ascent. The weather was manageable, but K2 was hiding its hand. The previous days had seen heavy snowfall, followed by high winds. For the experienced mountaineers listening, you know exactly what that combination creates. The wind slab. Let me explain the physics of what they were walking on, because it is terrifying. A wind slab is essentially a heavy plate of cohesive snow that is resting on top of a weak, loose layer of ice crystals. Imagine a heavy pane of glass resting on a bed of marbles. It looks solid. It feels solid under your crampons, but it is under immense tension. All it needs is a trigger the weight of a single climber to shatter the bond. Once that bond breaks, the entire slope, thousands of tons of snow, releases instantly. Nick and Doug reached a section of the route known as the convex slope. It was a traverse, meaning they had to walk horizontally across the mountainside rather than straight up. This is always a nervous moment for a climber. When you climb up, gravity pulls you into the wall. When you traverse, you are exposed. Nick Estcourt was in the lead. He stepped out onto the open snowfield. Doug Scott was behind him, managing the rope. According to the accounts later given by Scott, the snow felt peculiar. It had a hollow feel to it, a drum-like quality. Every step sent a subtle vibration through the surface. But in the Himalayas, you are constantly making calculated risks. If you stopped every time the snow felt imperfect, you would never leave base camp. They pressed on. Nick was moving rhythmically, his head down against the wind, focused on the path to Camp 2. He was about halfway across the slope. Doug Scott was just entering the traverse, a short distance behind. Then, the mountain spoke. It wasn't a rumble at first. It was a crack, a sharp, violent report, like a rifle shot, that echoed through the thin air. In a fraction of a second, the entire slope fractured. The white surface that Nick Estcourt was standing on didn't just slide, it shattered. A massive slab of snow, hundreds of feet wide and several feet deep, broke away from the mountain face. Doug Scott, with the reflexes honed by a lifetime of climbing, instinctively threw himself backward, driving his ice axe into the stable snow behind him. He watched in horror as the world in front of him disintegrated. Nick didn't have a chance. He didn't have time to run, to self-arrest, or even to scream. The ground simply ceased to exist beneath his feet. The rope between them, that thin, multicolored nylon line that symbolizes the bond between climbers, snapped tight. For a heart-stopping moment, Doug Scott braced for the impact, expecting to be ripped off the mountain, along with his friend. The physics were against him. A falling man, combined with tons of accelerating snow, generates a force that no single ice axe can withstand. But then, the unthinkable happened. The rope went slack. It wasn't because Nick had stopped falling. It was because the force of the avalanche was so violent, so overwhelming, that it simply overwhelmed the system. The snow swept Nick Estcourt down the steep face of the West Ridge, tumbling him like a rag doll into the abyss. The avalanche roared down the mountain, pouring over the cliffs and thundering thousands of feet down toward the glacier below. And then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The dust cloud hung in the freezing air, shimmering in the sunlight. Up on the ridge, there was only silence. Doug Scott was left alone, kneeling in the snow, his chest heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the frayed end of the rope or the empty slope where his friend had been just 10 seconds ago. There was no movement, no shout for help, no flash of a red climbing suit against the white snow. Just the vast, indifferent silence of the Karakoram. Nick Estcourt, the father, the husband, the anchor of the British team, was gone. The tragedy of a slab avalanche is its speed. It denies you the chance to say goodbye. 1 minute, you are talking to your friend about the route, about the tea you'll drink at the next camp, about your kids back home. The next minute, you are staring at a void. Doug Scott, a man who had seen death up close many times, sat there on the ridge, processing the impossible. The perfect team had been broken. The expedition was effectively over, though the physical struggle to get down was just beginning. But in that moment, the only thing that mattered was the crushing weight of loss. The mountain had taken the best of them. The minutes following a major accident in the high mountains are not like the movies. There is no swelling orchestral music. There is no frantic heroic dash to the rescue. There is only a paralyzing sense of disbelief. Doug Scott stood alone on the edge of the fracture line. Below him, the slope had been scrubbed clean. Where Nick had been standing just moments before, there was only the hard blue ice of the mountain's subsurface, exposed like a wound. He peered down into the abyss. The avalanche had traveled nearly 4,000 feet, cascading over a series of seracs and rock bands before settling on the glacier far below. The scale of the slide was absolute. In the world of alpinism, we talk about survivable fall slips on ice, or tumbling down a ski slope. But a fall of this magnitude, encased in tons of churning snow, offers zero margin for survival. Doug knew this. He was one of the most experienced men on Earth. He knew the physics of a fall like that. But the human heart is a stubborn thing. It refuses to accept what the brain knows to be true. Down at Camp 1, and further down at Advanced Base Camp, the rest of the team felt the vibration, or heard the crack. They looked up. They saw the debris cloud settling. And then, they waited for the radio. The silence on the radio in a moment like that is heavy. It has a physical weight. Every second that ticks by without a voice checking in feels like an hour. Finally, the word came down. It wasn't a panic-stricken scream. It was likely a flat, hollow transmission. The message that every expedition leader dreads more than anything else. Nick is gone. For Chris Bonington, this was a catastrophe on multiple levels. As the expedition leader, he was responsible for the lives of everyone on the permit. But as a man, he had just lost his right hand. Nick Estcourt wasn't just a climber to Chris, he was a confidant. They had shared tents, meals, and the triumph of Everest. Nick was the person Chris leaned on when the pressure became too much. The news shattered the team's morale instantly. You have to remember, these men were the ATIM. They were supposed to be untouchable. They had survived the Ogre, Everest, and enough. They had begun to feel, perhaps subconsciously, that they were immune to the random violence of the mountains. Nick's death was a brutal reality check. It proved that no amount of skill, fitness, or experience can protect you when the mountain simply decides to let go. The immediate aftermath involved a grim assessment. Was a search possible? The team looked down at the debris cone on the glacier thousands of feet below. It was a chaotic mess of ice blocks and compacted snow. To go down there, to search under the hanging threat of more avalanches from the West Ridge, would be suicide. And for what? The grim reality of mountaineering dictates that you do not risk the living for the dead. There would be no rescue mission. There would be no helicopter extraction. Nick Estcourt, a man who loved his family and the quiet beauty of the hills, was now part of K2. The decision that followed was almost immediate. In some expeditions, after a death, there is a debate. Should we continue in his honor? Would he have wanted us to finish the climb? You hear these rationalizations often, but not this time. The death of Nick Estcourt sucked the oxygen out of the expedition. The West Ridge had shown its hand. The snow conditions were clearly unstable, and the route was a death trap. But more than that, the heart of the team had stopped beating. Chris Bonington, Pete Boardman, Joe Tasker, Doug Scott, these were hard men. They were accustomed to suffering, but they were also a family. When you lose a brother, you don't keep playing the game. They began the heartbreaking process of dismantling the camps. Imagine the atmosphere in those tents that night. The empty sleeping bag, the mug that wouldn't be used. The gear that Nick had packed with such care, now just dead weight to be carried down. This is the part of the story that often gets skipped in the history books. We read expedition, Mabania. But those two words hide a world of pain. The descent from a tragedy is infinitely harder than the ascent. On the way up, you are fueled by adrenaline and hope. On the way down, you are carrying the weight of a ghost. Every step down the West Ridge was a reminder of what had happened. They had to cross similar terrain. They had to walk past the very spot where the avalanche had triggered, knowing that it could happen again. The psychological strain was immense. For the American audience listening, think about the tight-knit units in Vietnam or specialized fire crews. When one man goes down, the unit is never the same. The 1978 British expedition didn't just lose a climber. They lost their innocence. The golden era of British high-altitude climbing, characterized by that feeling of invincibility, died on the slope with Nick Estcourt. As they reached base camp, the adrenaline faded, and the administrative nightmare began. They had to notify the authorities. They had to pack up tons of equipment. And, hardest of all, Chris Bonington had to think about the telegram or the phone call he would have to make to Caroline Estcourt. How do you tell a wife that her husband, one of the strongest men in the world, has simply vanished? How do you explain to 3 children that their father is never coming home from his great adventure? This is the burden of leadership. This is the price of the high peaks. We glorify the summits, the flags, and the records. But the true cost of K2 is paid in these moments. In the long, silent trek out of the Beltoro Glacier, leaving a friend behind in the ice, they left Nick there. To this day, the body of Nick Estcourt has not been recovered in the way we typically think of burials. He rests in the shadow of the mountain he sought to climb. But the story doesn't quite end with the team walking away, because K2 is a story that spans generations. And grief, like a glacier, moves slowly, but it carves deep valleys over time. What happened to the survivors? How did Doug Scott, the man who stood inches from death, process the fact that he lived while Nick died? And how would this tragedy haunt the British climbing community for decades to come? Coming home from a mountain that has killed your friend is a jarring, almost violent experience. You transition from the absolute, freezing purity of the death zone where the only thing that matters is survival to the chaotic noise of civilization. For the surviving members of the 1978 expedition, the flight back to London wasn't a return to safety. It was a procession into a different kind of storm. When they landed, the press was waiting. In 1978, mountaineering was front-page news in the UK. These men were celebrities. But how do you explain to a reporter in a suit, someone who has never been above sea level, why a father of 3 is dead? How do you explain that calculated risk sometimes just means bad luck? Chris Bonington, the leader, faced the heaviest burden. There is an old maritime tradition. The captain is responsible for the ship. In mountaineering, the leader is responsible for the souls on the permit. Even though the avalanche was an act of God, a geological roll of the dice, Bonington carried the weight of it. He had to do the hardest thing any man can do. He had to go to Nick's home. He had to sit in the living room with Caroline Estcourt. He had to look into the eyes of Nick's children. There is no training manual for that conversation. You can't diagram it like a climbing route. You simply have to sit in the grief. Caroline Estcourt was a woman of immense strength, a climber's wife who understood the game. But understanding the game doesn't make the loss hurt any less. For Doug Scott, the trauma was different. It was visceral. He was the survivor. He was the one standing 10 feet away. He was the one the avalanche missed. Psychologists call it survivor's guilt. It's that gnawing, irrational voice in the back of your head that asks, why him? Why not me? If I had been in the lead, would I be the one in the ice? Doug Scott went on to have a long, illustrious career, becoming a knight of the realm and a philanthropist. But those who knew him well said that the 1978 K2 expedition left a scar that never fully faded. You don't watch your friend disappear into the white void and simply get over it. You carry that silence with you for the rest of your life. The tragedy of 1978 also marked the beginning of the end for that golden generation. The band of brothers began to fracture not emotionally, but physically. The mountains were claiming them one by one. Just 4 years later, in 1982, Peter Boardman and Joe Tasker, two of the brilliant young climbers who were there on K2 with Nick, disappeared on the northeast ridge of Everest. Like Nick, they vanished. Like Nick, they left a hole in the community that couldn't be filled. It felt like a curse. The men who had felt invincible in the mid-70s were being humbled by the savage indifference of the high peaks. But amidst the grief, something beautiful emerged. And this is important for us to remember. Caroline Estcourt didn't retreat into bitterness. She, along with the mountaineering community, established the Nick Estcourt Award. This award became a lifeline for the next generation. It provided grants to young mountaineers who wanted to attempt difficult, adventurous climbs, the kind of climbs Nick loved. Think about the poetry of that. The mountain took Nick's life, but his legacy fueled the dreams of hundreds of young climbers who followed in his footsteps. For over 40 years, every time a young British climber pinned a number to their pack or booked a ticket to the Karakoram, thanks to that grant, Nick Estcourt was there with them. He was still climbing, in spirit. However, for the family, for the children who grew up without a father, there was still one painful, unresolved note. There was no grave. When a soldier dies in war, there is a body to bring home. When a person dies in a hospital, there is a funeral. But in high-altitude mountaineering, the body often remains where it fell. K2 became Nick's tomb. He was frozen in time, encased in the ice of the West Ridge, somewhere between the camps. For decades, the family had to live with that abstraction. He was just gone. The glacier is a slow-moving river of ice. It hides things. It buries secrets under 40 years of snow. But glaciers also move. They grind, they flow downhill, and eventually, they give back what they have taken. For 44 years, the silence of the West Ridge held its secret. The seasons changed. The world changed. We went from rotary phones to smartphones. The Cold War ended. The kids grew up. And then, in the summer of 2022, the mountain decided it was time to speak again. Most stories of the 1970s end in the history books. We close the chapter and move on. But K2 isn't history. It is a living, breathing, shifting entity. 2 years ago, a Sherpa team and a cleaning expedition were working on the glacier, far below the site of the accident. They were scanning the ice for trash, for old ropes, trying to clean up the mountain. They saw something unusual melting out of the ice. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't a piece of modern nylon. It was a piece of history, waiting to be found. In July 2022, 44 years after the avalanche, the mountain finally relinquished its hold. A team of Nepali guides and climbers, conducting a cleanup operation on the glacier below the West Ridge, spotted something bright against the gray moraine. It wasn't the neon yellow or orange of modern gear. It was distinctively retro. As they got closer, the timeline became clear. They found the remains of a climber, but more importantly, they found personal effects. Artifacts from a different era. News traveled quickly from the Karakoram to the UK. The details matched perfectly. The location on the glacier aligned with where the ice would have carried a fallen climber over 4 decades. The clothing was consistent with the 1978 expedition. It was Nick. After nearly half a century of silence, Nick Estcourt had returned to the surface. For Carolyn Estcourt and her 3 children, now grown adults, with families of their own, this news brought a wave of complex emotions. It was a reopening of an old wound, yes, but it was also the closing of a circle. The uncertainty was gone. The missing status was erased. There is a profound peace in knowing. In alpinism we accept that the mountains are dangerous, but the human soul struggles with the concept of the void. We need a place. We need a marker. The family, in a display of grace and acceptance, decided not to try and bring the remains back to England. Nick belonged to the mountains. He died doing what he loved, surrounded by the peaks that defined his life. He was laid to rest there, properly this time, in the shadow of K2. Nick Estcourt's story is a reminder of the price of admission to these wild places. It teaches us that nature is vast, powerful, and indifferent to our schedules or our skills. But it also teaches us about the resilience of the human spirit. The rope snapped in 1978, but the connection didn't. Through the pain of his friends like Doug Scott and Chris Bonington, and through the strength of his wife Caroline, Nick's legacy didn't just survive, it thrived. The Nick Estcourt Award has helped hundreds of young climbers realize their dreams. In a way, Nick has cemented 1,000 peaks since that day in June. K2 is often called the Savage Mountain, and it is. It takes without mercy. But if you wait long enough, sometimes, just sometimes, it gives something back. If you have watched this far, it means you understand that these aren't just stories about adrenaline and summits. These are stories about the human condition, about love, loss, and the enduring bond between climbers. Here at K2 Stories, we are dedicated to keeping these histories alive. We dig deep into the archives to bring you the truth about the world's most dangerous mountains. We have dozens more stories like this, tales of survival, mystery, and the golden age of alpinism that you won't find anywhere else. But we need your help to tell them. So, please, do 2 things for us right now. First, hit that like button to honor the memory of Nick Estcourt. And second, click subscribe and ring the bell. Join our expedition. Let's explore the history of the high peaks together. I'll see you in the next video. Stay safe out there.